We're continuing our series of videos in this unit, Unit 5, by looking at what happened to the occupied countries that were occupied by the Nazis between 1939 and 1945. And in this video, I'd like to look at responses to occupation. So how individuals responded when their countries were occupied. Now, we can simplify this down really into three different ways of responding to the Nazis. Some people collaborated with the Nazis, so there was collaboration. They worked with the Nazis and they helped them rule. Some individuals accommodated the Nazis. They did as they were told, but they didn't actively help them. Some people resisted the Nazis. They opposed the Nazis, and we've talked about resistance and opposition before in previous videos. Sometimes that opposition was passive, sometimes it was very active. Now, that is a little bit of a simplification though, because it wasn't as simple as some people collaborated, some people accommodated, and some people resisted. If I'm really honest, it looked a little bit more like this. It's really like a continuum line. And there were massive areas of grey areas between these three terms. So some people collaborated, but the extent of their collaboration depended on the individual and the country and their circumstances. And we're going to look at some people in a minute who collaborated a lot. There were also some people who resisted a lot, but there were some people who were definitely in the middle, or who on occasions might have slightly collaborated, who on occasion might have slightly resisted. So it's really, to me, as a sliding scale. And actually, when you look at the experiences of individuals in these countries, often there are individuals who actually did all three of these things. Let's look at a case study. And the case study I'd like to look at is France, which was occupied by the Axis powers, or Nazi Germany, between 1940 and 1944. France is an interesting case study to look at about responses to Nazi rule, because actually it was split into two different countries. The yellow area that you can see at the top here, the northern and the western regions of France, were directly run by the Germans. This is the German occupation zone. And the reason why the Germans directly controlled those areas is they wanted to control Paris, which is obviously the capital of France, and they also wanted to control the Atlantic coast, so they were ready for any attacks that might happen. They did allow the French, though, to actually run their own southern end of the country, and the southern end of the country was a free zone, not directly controlled by the Nazi Germans, but by a right-wing government. Now, that right-wing government in the free zone was ran the country out of a place called Vichy, which you can see in the north of this region here in the blue bit. And the Vichy government were not directly controlled by the Nazis, but were indirectly. They were very right-wing, they were fascist, they also shared many of their views. Now, looking at responses to occupation in both of those places is utterly fascinating, because in France you can see people who collaborated, accommodated and resisted the Nazis. Let's look at two individuals. Now, the first individual I'd like to introduce you to is André Trocmé. And André Trocmé is arguably, and I think so, a hero of this period. He was a Protestant pastor in the eastern region of France, in the eastern mountainous region of France. And Trocmé, a Christian, decided that what he saw was happening to the Jews was abhorrent. It was horrible what was happening to them. So Trocmé helped to hide Jews. And he was a pastor in a mountain village, and in his village and the surrounding villages, they hid over 5,000 Jews in those 4 years. And actually, from 1943 onwards, Trocmé himself had to hide because the SS were realising what was happening. That, to me, is a really brilliant example of resistance. He's going against what the Nazis are doing to stop them in their tracks. That was one person. But if you think about that, that took a lot of bravery to do it. Let's look at another individual. And this individual you might have heard of before, and her name is Coco Chanel. and she is a fashion designer. It was Coco Chanel that helped create the perfume that probably most of you know. Now, Coco Chanel is a classic example of someone who collaborated with the Nazis. She befriended the Nazi officers as soon as they occupied Paris, and in fact actually she had an affair with one of those Nazi officers. She also tried to persuade the Nazis to remove the Jewish directors from her company, and she was rumoured to be a German spy. She was rumoured to be in contact with Himmler, and she was rumoured to be sending letters to Winston Churchill to try and persuade him from attacking. Coco Chanel is another classic example to me of that idea of somebody who collaborated. So here we've got two people, and to be honest, these are at two extremes of that continuum line. Coco Chanel collaborated with the Nazis. Trocmé resisted the Nazis. Think about why they might have done that, because I think that's the key with responses to Nazi occupation is, what would you have done? What was going through their minds? Now, this idea about responses to Nazi Germany, really, if you think about the fact that the Nazis occupied this area in red, that was most of Europe. And those responses, collaboration, accommodation, resistance, we can see throughout these places. And even within a country, you might have got differences. Let's look at some key examples. So for example, in Denmark here, which you can see to the north of Germany, there was actually quite a lot of accommodation because the Danes were left alone. The Danes were seen as Aryan, and as a result, they were really left alone to do what they wanted. Trade continued with Germany during this time. The Danish government still existed during this time. And actually, the Danish government was strong enough they were able to resist demands to remove the Jews from Denmark. So there was accommodation. Not necessarily collaboration, but definitely working with them. In Belgium, there was definite examples of massive collaboration. There was a very right-wing group called De Vlag, and that had 50,000 members. 50,000 members, that's a sizable number of people who actually helped recruit people to the Waffen-SS. In France, as we've already talked about, there was widespread resistance, and the French resistance was actually throughout the country at this time. They published newspapers and they spied for the British. In Poland, Polish citizens equally helped to resist the Nazi rule. And Polish citizens, and we've talked about how bad occupation was in Poland before, helped to hide and save 450,000 Jews, arguably. In Greece, right down here at the southern tip, 3 Greek prime ministers were controlled by the Nazis and passed laws for them to help crush the communist resistance. So even these 5 examples here, you can see collaboration, accommodation, resistance. But the really important point that I want you to start thinking about with this is the following. For individuals in the countries that were occupied by the Nazis, deciding whether to collaborate, accommodate or resist is not a simple decision. It's a complicated decision. If you resist, you are putting yourself in danger of being killed. If you collaborate, are you collaborating? Are you helping them to the extent that they are then going to be able to do awful things to other people? So if you collaborate with the Nazis, is that enabling them to help remove the Jews? If you accommodate, is that the best thing to do? Just sit back and do nothing? Can you sit there with your morals and think that was the right thing to do? And I think really the idea about responses to Nazi Germany, the most important question we really should be thinking about is, what would you have done? Imagine that the Nazis occupied your country. What would you have done? I think it's very easy to think, I definitely would have resisted. But would you? Is that what you actually would have done?